Mancini. Mancini was the campus minister there. Yeah. Ho, ho, hot, ho. Yeah, careful what you say, right? The hot mic. Good morning. Okay. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started as we trickle in. We won't call this the auditorium class. We'll just call it the trickle class. Is what we got. Well, welcome. Sorry to interrupt all that fellowship. What a terrible thing fellowship is, isn't it? Messes everything up. No. Many feel that same need. So, well, I'll use that as a barometer. Okay, sorry. Some of this may be old information for folks. So as we've been looking at this section, we've been looking at the various responses that were going on to all the changes and the things that were going on in the culture, and so on and so forth. And we saw that kind of a lot of the mainline responses. We saw that in the late 60s, for a few years, you had what was called the campus ministry movement, which was the precursor of what would be Crossroads and so on and so forth, and that emphasis. And then we also saw that there was the efforts to publicly, advertise the One Nation Under God and the different nationwide programs that were attempted, and saw that, really those were just kind of similar to what other Protestant groups were doing, and so on and so forth, and with that message. And then we saw also that there was the evangelism and the soul-winning workshops, like down at Garnett Road, and those that were very popular, and went on, though that does not exist anymore, at least not that one, in that form bill. Yeah. Okay. Uh-huh. Yeah. Sure.
They were in the community as a church. Every Sunday after service, they had a fellowship meal. But it was a picnic under the milder conditions if it wasn't rain, which is Seattle is well known for. But if so, they did it in the auditorium.
Mm-hmm.
They had a neighborhood picnic.
Sure.
And people would come in from all over the area, and they would just have a big fellowship picnic. And immediately afterwards, they would have a singing and a devotional. And I just thought, wow, that was really community spirit that was out there reaching out. What a best way to get the community to come to you is throw some good apple pie and baked beans and all those kind of things at them and say, come and help us eat it.
Food has always been a great attraction, and of course that's very biblical, right? As we can see various examples of that. So certainly for sure. And so we then started on what was again part of that evangelism response, but from a very different perspective, and that was what was known as the Crossroads movement, and later the Boston movement, and later the ICOC. And in some things, for some, a different branch off of that later became the International Christian Churches. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And so this was within the confines of our restoration history, though there was kind of a splitting off that also happened. And so how many of us have heard of Crossroads? Most of us heard of that. Was it good? Was it not good? What did you hear about it? You don't remember? Okay.
My brush with Crossroads was very negative.
Okay.
Yes, same here. And my experience, though, came from when I was, what was it, 20 years, 40 years ago?
Probably 40.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when I was heavily involved in the conservative movement.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you hear?
Very negative.
And what was it that was negative? Pardon?
Whole sermons preached against them because they were too liberal.
And how were they liberal?
In every way that you could think of.
In other words, very different from us, so to speak, because usually that's what that means. You know, that's a great point that you made about anything. Is that, you know, often we formulate our understandings and our ideas about a lot of things, controversial or not controversial, and it isn't always from personal experience. It is from a distance, and so those that we listen to and so on will say, you know, things and, you know, make sense to us, and so we form all these things, and the trouble is that may or may not be very correct or accurate, and again, whatever it is. And so that was certainly many. Anybody else? You don't remember why? Yeah. And so we're going to take a little bit of look, because this was a very significant movement in the 70s and in the 80s. Now, you know, my personal experience is we came into contact with this in 1980 up in Kirksville. And so I was baptized in 1981 and through a campus ministry. And though it wasn't a direct crossroads, it was very, very similar. And those that were influenced, so the people that were there didn't come from there, planted there. Oh, that's what it is. Let me try that. There we go. And so the most visible and significant new effort to revitalize churches along sectarian lines, very exclusive, occurred. It was at the University of Florida campus, which is in Gainesville, and it was the Crossroads congregation where Chuck Lucas was, and thus the name Crossroads Movement, because from that congregation. And under the oversight of the Crossroads Church of Christ, as a product of the campus evangelism movement. So Chuck Lucas was at those meetings that were in Dallas and whatever the other places were, as was the minister that was in Kirksville that had come up there from Springfield, Missouri, in the old South National Church, which is now the East Sunshine. And he had been part of that, and so there was many that were very interested in the outreach and evangelism, especially through campus work. And so there was many that were involved with that, so to speak. And so Lucas began the work at the congregation in 1967, only 2 months after the birth of campus evangelism itself. And so that's where he was at. Oh, come on. What am I doing, Heidi? There we go. But Lucas brought to the campus ministry a dimension that was lacking in the campus evangelism movement we previously talked about. He combined our exclusive sectarian kind of view of things and discipling methods that he claimed that he found in the ministry of Jesus. And so the Crossroads movement was also known as the discipling movement. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Lucas maintained that one method of evangelism employed by Jesus called on each disciple to make disciples of others on a one-on-one basis. In other words, relationship. He argued the modern churches were in decline because they were not following that simple strategy. And at the time, you know, in the general time of this, there was a lot of books that were coming out. One was called The Master Plan of Evangelism. Now, that was not written by someone in the Churches of Christ. But there was, you know, in other groups, there are these concerns also, you know, on these things. And so I remember in college, we were all, you know, told, hey, let's all read this and work on this together and so on. And so this idea was really blossoming at the time. He argued that modern churches were in decline, as we said, for not following this simple strategy of one-on-one kind of relationships, and instead set up programs and devised strategies that allowed individual Christians to avoid the task of confronting others directly with the gospel. And so what does that mean? Well, you know, for example, with preaching, we've also always wanted to let the preaching work on people, and that way we don't necessarily have to be involved. And so that involvement factor is I think what the point of the emphasis was. And so programs and things and readings and all that, which is fine and good, but they would say it was lacking that aspect. But Lucas added another key dimension to discipling strategies. He insisted that discipling another person entailed a good deal more than simply winning a person over as a convert. And of course, that's often been a shortcoming that we've had. It's, you know, hey, they're baptized, and now you're on your own. And not that there's no interaction or things like that, but certainly not a purpose and so on. And so, and we all understand that. And so it entailed entering into a relationship with the convert, monitoring his or her behavior, and calling each convert to nothing less than what they term total commitment. And so in the Crossroad movement, that was a phrase that was used often, and that was about you're giving your whole self to Christ. And of course, as we read the scriptures and all that, we understand it says that. The challenge was that isn't always the case. And so this is something that really energized them very much and was a contrast from what they believed that the mainline churches and others were just, you know, lukewarm and things such as that, and weren't really totally committed to everything, and were kind of just slack. And you know we've heard the term pew sitters, people that just come in, or people that just, you know, even worse, those that only come at Christmas and Easter, right? And so on. So it's that kind of concept that we're talking about here. And so so this life, and so one was to dedicate his or her life to converting others, reaching out to others, and teaching them and developing them so that then they could reach others. And so you see a multi-generational, if you will, approach to this, producing, and so that they can produce and so on. And anything short of this, our author describes as grounds of discipline. In other words, that was a great focus. And if you weren't in on that, then encourage is probably a nice word to how to do that, because that's what we're supposed to do. And so that was the focus. Yes. And we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. And so what she said was one of the negatives that was out there was that they're trying to tell you everything to do about every aspect of your life. And What kind of discipline? Well, it could be things like, you're the person you're with, and that was called prayer partners, was a term that we used. And so the idea behind that, I'm going to get to your answer, but the idea behind that was that someone more mature in the faith, and perhaps the person that you studied the Bible with, and so the assumption is that they are more spiritually mature and grounded, and just like someone older giving advice to someone younger, and from experiences and so on, and so that they would help guide and direct and so on and so forth. And so eventually it could got into that. Yeah, that wasn't an initial thing, but no, it got into those things too. But we'll touch on that. Using these strategies, Lucas achieved results in the campus of the University of Florida that were truly startling, certainly for our fellowship. And that was the Crossroads congregation grew in total membership from about 275 in 1970 to about 1,000 in about 7 years. Well, that's enough to get your attention. And with most of the growth coming from student converts. By 1979, many mainstream churches of Christ were accusing Lucas of leading a cult. And of course, that's the negative stuff. And we're going to talk about that. And so in this short time, this explosive growth, well, to those that are in the fellowship and are concerned about those things, you're going, what are they doing? Look at this. Hey, this is what we want to do, but we aren't effective. We're not doing it like, and so on and so forth. And so as with other things that we've seen along, what happens? Well, you get invited to speak at this seminar, at this program, at this gathering, and so on and so forth. And so that's what was happening, certainly initially in things. And then, so very, very significant. T. Pierce Brown argued in the Gospel Advocate to challenge young and old with total commitment and sacrificial living for Christ and have them to respond is thrilling. Hey, we want people to be all in on Jesus and the things that we should do. But when I see an insidious and creeping cultism, mind control, and perverted Christianity masquerading under the guise of positive mental attitude, progress, and enthusiastic devotion to the Lord, I weep. And so what is he talking about? Well, what he's talking about is what you were kind of alluding to. And that was that in these relationships, that guidance and so on was on everything. And now, to say this, when you're a college student, we usually need a lot of guidance. And especially if you're coming out of the world and all the things that the world's doing, the party atmosphere, the drunk, all that goes on campuses. And that, pardon? On every campus. And even the church colleges. And there are those that could talk about that more specifically, I guess. And so there was a lot of that. And so when you're coming out and you're giving your life to Christ, that doesn't mean the way you used to think and do things all of a sudden disappears automatically. And there's a growing and all that, just like in any change in life and doing things differently. And so as a result of that makes sense. That's adding a certain structure that maybe wasn't there before. And a lot of it was good. A lot of that was good. Because those temptations and all those things that you readily gave into, well, now you don't do that anymore. And so you got someone you're in relationship with that you can share those struggles with and so on and so forth. did some other guidance. We used to have, you know, of a Kirksville, and I'm sure this is similar, is that you had, you know, when traditional Wednesday night, and that was good to gather. And why do we all think that was good? Well, we need a, you know, energy booster because of the week of being out in the world, right? And so that understanding, and which is true. But we also had devotionals on Friday nights, and which were good. And why is that? Because what's often happening on Friday nights? Now, at colleges, you get the big party. They'll be partying every night of the week, but certainly on Fridays and Saturdays. And so, having an opportunity to not be tempted to that was a good thing. And you know, all the singing, and you know, the devotional song. Many of us remember those things in other venues and so on. It was great, and deep relationships formed, and so on and so forth. So these things are really, really good and really important. However, you know, what were those negatives? You know, were you getting challenged? Are you reaching out to others? How many did you reach out to today? You know, and so on and so forth. Have you read your Bible today? How long did you spend in prayer today? Now, in and of themselves, okay. You know, but then. What was happening was, you know, let's say you're more introverted, you struggle with it some, we all get afraid. We're all afraid. We'll look stupid or think, you know, whatever. And so, you know, what was happening is that there was a great emphasis on numbers, because the idea that numbers means that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Donita.
One way that I would describe it real quickly, forced friendships. A lot of the whole concept
Yeah.
can be very spiritual, very biblical
Yeah.
if it's authentic. But when it becomes a forced thing like that,
Yeah.
it is not biblical.
Yeah.
It's not authentic. And for people who've been through it, this, just even talking about it right now, brings like PTSD symptoms on. I'm not joking.
I understand.
I'm not joking. And it was a cult, it is a cult. That's all I'm gonna say.
But isn't that why
If
Jerry
anybody wants to
started?
talk further, I'll shoot.
Well, what was the result of that?
Yeah.
It's a separate story. Bill had his hand.
Bill.
I would just kind of overlaying an image that I had put before me here. T. Pierce Brown,
Did you know who that was?
high priest, 8 months before Christ's crucifixion, and he says, and he argues in their local advocate message, I was going to see where I started here. But when I see an insidious and creeping criticism and mind control and perverted Judaism masqueraded under the guise of positive mental attitude, progress, and enthusiastic devotion to to God,
Yeah.
I weep.
Yeah.
This sounds like something that you would have expected a Pharisee to say back just months before Christ
Interesting.
was crucified.
Well, I don't disagree with what you're saying. You know, and so you see there was conflict, because you say, hey, wait a minute, they're reaching people where we're not reaching people. They're, you know, and so it wasn't this path. And then so those that were in it, like anything, it affects people different ways. Some, you know, some negatively, some positively. I think, you know, when we're talking about the prayer partners, discipling relationship, those were usually assigned. Those were like, hey, we kind of get along. You want to, it wasn't that way. It was kind of, you were assigned. And again, that organizational structure is greater efficiency as far as structure and those kind of things, and so that was part of it.
But the problem that I ran into,
Uh-huh,
was one where they had overreach
sure,
into the lives of the young people. That was the thing that I saw, that I got involved. I had a young black engineer, just gotten out of college, was working in McDonald at that time. He came into my office one day and says, "Are you an elder of the church?" And I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "Do you allow your young people to date just anyone they want?" I said, "Huh?" "Sit down, let's talk." He had gotten into the church through this movement. I don't remember what school now, someplace, one of the northeastern schools. And there was a young lady there at McDonald that he wanted to date who was not a member of their
movement,
group.
yeah,
And they would not allow him to date her. And I said, "I see no problem with you dating her. You gotta remember, you don't wanna marry her until you've converted her." I said, "We could talk about that, but I see no problem with you dating her." "Oh, they won't let me. I just don't understand." I finally got him involved in one of the black congregations down in the city through a mutual friend that was an elder there,
mm-hmm,
that happened to also work at McDonald. And ultimately, he came out of that movement,
yeah,
but he was overwhelmed by the fact that I said, "They don't even ask us, they date who they wanna date."
They ask their mom and dad.
Yeah, you have to talk to their mom and dad, I don't get a voice in that. And but he couldn't get over that.
Yeah.
That as an elder, I didn't tell them who they could date. And what I saw coming out of that, and then I talked with Jerry about it. And as you know, Jerry has been involved in that.
yeah,
We're going to the last full bubble this summer. Full bubble was
I know what that is,
a reaction group to that movement,
to the people coming out of it,
Yes.
bringing
Yeah.
people out of it, helping people to deprogram. And that was what basically I wound up having to do with this young man, was help him deprogram.
yeah,
But that was where I saw them making a big mistake, is they got overreach into people's lives. What they were doing was good until it got too far over the
Yeah.
top.
yeah. And that's a great, point and perspective, in that, talking along the lines of this exclusiveness that Donita was, you were not only paired up with people that, may or may not have been a good pairing.
Right.
We're all different. Doesn't mean it's bad or good, or that because someone doesn't get along as well with, that isn't necessarily bad, it's just that those two personalities or whatever. And it could be other things, but but it also happened with marriages and with other things, and so there were those that were married under direction of this thing, and it was very interesting that later, you found in this that, all of a sudden this leadership couple's being pulled out from here to go to Chicago so they could, an often used phrase was work on their marriage. And there was others that those things was the case. And again, just showing the extent or the overreach. Donita.
When you mentioned personality, that is extremely important because it became like the overriding personality that was accepted was extreme extrovert.
Extrovert.
And so those of us who are more introverted and see a need in being still and knowing that I am God, there was no, well, anyway, it was
Sure.
almost ludicrous when you could sit back and see what was happening,
Yeah. There was
yeah.
a
So
great
much of
emphasis on
how I
extrovert.
dealt with things was just keeping my mouth shut.
No.
Sometimes you just gotta do what you gotta do to get through things, but until you can't anymore.
Now I was one that viewed a lot of this differently than obviously Donita did. Donita saw a lot of this before I did, for sure. And part of it is that, you know, you train yourself, or you're trained to not question, or to explain away
Or to find the best in people.
what your,
all
you know,
the
what your
time.
thoughts are, or what your concerns are. And again, part of that is not totally nuts, you know, because we understand we got sinful hearts and, you know, those kind of things, and we could find, you know, and so on and so forth. But so a lot of those concerns for some of us, we squashed before they got way out there. And so then when you have the conflict, and it caused us a lot of conflict for a long time, certainly early on. And so there's those concerns about that. And so why did they do that? Well, because they felt that they're given that direction. It's that totally sold out. It's that, but the idea was that really the ideal Christian is an extrovert. Why is that? Well, Jesus was an extrovert, was he? Yeah, but he also got secluded a lot. You know, and of course that part's not always discussed as much. You know, so because that doesn't fit the narrative.
But yet, he was the perfect.
Yeah.
He was the perfect mix of extrovert, introvert.
He could.
And the rest of us tend to be on either side of that line.
Or however, and so Chuck Lucas was an extrovert.
Oh yeah.
Kit McKean certainly was an extrovert. And so, hey, wait a minute. Look at all the success we're having, and I'm at the top of this. So that's what everybody should be like, because the more success, the more people save. The more, and so it becomes this system and this machinery to where those concerns about individuals sometimes get pushed aside because remember the greater importance. Donita,
I won't keep talking, but I just want to
she feels strongly
give
about
one
this.
really silly example, but it's also it just shows you how broad this was. I can remember people being instructed not to get washers and dryers in their homes so that they wouldn't give up an opportunity to get out and evangelize at a laundromat. And, you know, is that not sick? Absolutely sick.
She still feels strongly, obviously. Well, you know, one of the other things is, so when you have all this success, and again, we're human beings, and we shouldn't forget that. You start feeling pretty high on yourself, pretty important. Like you got it more figured out than everybody else does. And so, you know, those kind of things happen. For example, I remember, and this is a pet peeve of mine to this day, for a number of reasons, but they viewed what a waste having a facility like this, because it sucks the money out, and it does. I'm not saying it doesn't. You know, and it's not that there's not some substance to that understanding. And so because they chose to rent, they would speak on this as how this is superior to that. And so until they didn't, until they decided, oh, we can see the advantage of having a permanent place, if you will. And I always found that always really stood out to me. And again, they weren't always that way, but again, it was just this arbitrariness of the idea we have now. This is the biblical idea, and that, you know, others should do it this way because it's so clear to us. It should be so clear to you. And then all of a sudden, at some point, that changes. And now you hear other messages justifying why this is. Well, what about all that you said about that? And so this thing, I thought you weren't going to talk anymore.
I just have one.
Just
She's
joking.
experienced.
Just joking. Oh, very experienced. Yes.
Another example that is very telling involves the financial overreach. As young Christians, that was something we took very seriously from the very beginning, was being sacrificial and making sure that we were giving, what we could give, time-wise, money-wise, all of those. And I remember an instance in South Carolina at one point where, out of the blue, it was announced that there was going to be a great day in May that was going to be a contribution where everyone would give 10 times their normal contribution. I blew a gasket with Grant, and I said, this is absolutely ridiculous. We budget, we have already given. We do give more than, what we could really even give and so forth. And then, what really got me was when the leadership was getting up there and giving examples of what people could do to come up with the funds. Have a garage sale and sell your furs and your blah, 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 and your crystal. And I'm like,
Ooh, that's it.
you know
We
what?
don't have any furs
You
and
people,
crystals.
if you had been sacrificial from the beginning, you wouldn't have an abundance of furs and crystal and all this stuff in your closets that you are going to then hawk for a great day in May. So.
So you can see almost,
The entire church building.
You really were a part of this, weren't you?
well,
I was, and you know what, though, the thing was, like I said, I could verbalize certain things and I could get by with it, and the reason I could get by with it is because they could always count on me as a boarding house, because I had a clean house, that any visiting ministers that came in or whoever, I would feed them, and I would, so it's like, they, it's just,
But you thought for yourself also.
I thought for myself. I didn't,
Wow.
as early as I could have, but once I started thinking for myself, I was going to continue to think for myself, because it's not healthy not to, and, I wouldn't be here today if I hadn't thought for myself.
sure.
I don't think Grant would be here either if I hadn't thought for myself, because maybe I helped him think for himself.
And I guess it's just a point, not trying to pour all this out, but, you can see how raw this is 40 years later, almost 40 years later. I remember I used to go from 0 to 60, I know 30 years after it, just at talking about it, kind of resolve. Carl.
Well, it's difficult to deal with this emotionally as an individual, because you read the scriptures and Jesus is very specific and very definite.
Yeah.
If your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out. I mean, how much more committed then can you be? Now, was he being literal? No, he's making a point that, look, you need to change. You need to repent of what you're doing and get out of that stuff. You can read Romans chapter 1. It's very clear right off the bat. And then you go to Galatians chapter 5, and you find out what good things there are. The problem is when others begin to assess your spiritualness or your personal conviction. Maybe it's a misunderstanding at the time. You're dealing with college kids that are trying to build personality
Figure it out.
and figure it out.
Yeah.
And yet you have somebody older than you lording it over you without your request. It's subtle, but it is dominating. But at the same time, the struggle comes when you are assessing your own spiritual nature and you're looking to God
Sure.
And you are looking to develop relationships and rapport and watch your behavior and that sort of thing. And continue to look in the mirror.
Yeah.
Because that's the only person you're responsible for is the one in the mirror.
Yeah.
And if you walk away and forget who that is, the Lord says, what is that? It's difficult to explain.
Sure.
But when you walk into a congregation such as this, or any congregation, and you're being assessed by your involvement in this group, that's hard. I'd like to think that I'm not out to over-convince somebody. What I want to say, I don't have the right words, but
Mhm.
I just want to be a Christian.
Yeah.
I'd like to think that my example leads others to give thought to their own condition with the Lord.
Would brainwashing fit?
Yes, that's a good one. But how do you know it's brainwashing when all these good things are being said? You see, it's insidious in nature. That a cultish environment, boy, I hate to hear that because, man, does that mean I've been part of a cult? You know,
Well, you know, I think what we're seeing here is just the real complexity of it.
Yes.
And I don't know, I don't think nuance is the right word, but, are you gonna say
Well, I
something
want
else?
to say something positive. And that is, not
we
all
found out about it.
aspects of every place were
Correct.
the same.
It wasn't all the
And,
same.
you know, we have very fond memories of many things that occurred in our college days.
In Kirksville, yeah.
Now, was the leadership there and ministers and so forth trying to follow some of this framework and so? Yes. Believe me, it was nothing like where it was in other places. And so, you know, I looked at those times as being the community involvement and the, you know, being involved in each
Very
other's
much so.
lives. It was authentic. It was authentic, for the most part. I mean, there were, I'm sure, problems and so, but for the most part, that was an authentic representation of Acts. And the problem is when things just snowballed and so much of this built where people were trying to climb the ranks of leadership. And the way they climbed the ranks of Bible study leader, or this intern, or this or that, or whatever, was just becoming, you know, more and more this introvert personality type profile and, you know, and so there were the Kirksvilles out there.
Sure. And again, it probably wasn't exactly the same everywhere, and part of that depended on the personalities of the leadership that was in those congregations. Because we know all are not the same. Some leaders can be beloved and others, they can't stand them, but they're the leader. And that could be in business or work or anything. And so, wow, okay, we've certainly had a lot of discussion this morning. And
it's the adage about when something about the hammer,
Yeah.
everything looks like a nail. Yeah. Well,
yeah,
in the toolbox, there's a lot of different things. People in the body have different talents, they have different gifts,
and so,
That's biblical.
well, you're right. And so it's different. And so when you're younger, you don't have that experience to bounce things off of, et cetera. And so it just kind of makes sense. Just one last comment before we end here today, is that I wanted to point this out, that these movements here were very exclusive. And part of that was because the felt was we're following the Bible most accurately and doing what we should be doing. And as a result of that touches on that nature of ours that says, hey, we're better than the others over here. And so what happened was it got to be where we looked at everybody that was not us, even those in churches of Christ. You know, if someone was baptized and the Church of Christ was not part of, we kind of viewed them with suspicion, even in Kirksville, some. And why? Because, well, did you really know all that you should know and properly and so on and so forth? Well, and so they had all their exclusiveness and their particulars. And I guess the point I wanted to make as we've looked back at our history, that same attitude of that real exclusive, legalistic determination who's a Christian or not based on how they interpret whatever long list of things, that it's the same attitude as that was, just different particulars, different points of emphasis. And that was something that I learned over, you know, obviously I'm a history geek, and over a long time, this stuff spurred me on. I wanted to know why in our history of things. And so you start seeing that, you know, it's really not that different, at least as far as the attitude. And so we've got in, and we'll continue on. We didn't go real far, but I think it was very important today. So thank you very much.